I thought I could manipulate him and hide my betrayals. But when my husband found out the truth, everything changed. Not only did he expose my tricks, but he also decided to take revenge in a way I could never have imagined. I felt fear when he started ignoring me, and then he began playing his own game. I didn't know if I could fix this, but it was already too late. My lies had come back to haunt me, and I couldn't escape this trap. What would he do next? I didn't know what triggered me to wake up that night. Maybe some internal signal, maybe just a random glitch in my routine. But when I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was the glow of her phone screen flashing on the nightstand. Julia lay beside me, breathing evenly, as if everything in her life was absolutely fine. I never wanted to be the kind of man who checks his wife's phone. I always thought it was degrading. But damn it, I hadn't woken up for no reason. I reached for the screen. A message from an unknown number. Last night was incredible. I keep thinking about you. My heart made a sharp leap in my chest. I wiped my palms on the blanket, rolled onto my side, and stared at her sleeping face. I had a choice. Right now, I could wake her up, start a fight, force her to make excuses. But something inside me worked differently. I wanted to know more. So I took her phone, tapped on the message, and opened the chat. Another message. I want to see you again. But what if he finds out? I felt cold sweat run down my spine. Who was this? Who was texting my wife as if they were lovers? I quickly scrolled through the chat. The messages had been deleted. But this guy had clearly texted her before. I put the phone back, trying not to breathe too loudly. What are you doing? I froze. Julia hadn't opened her eyes, but I knew she wasn't asleep. Her voice was hoarse, drowsy, but with a hint of caution. Nothing, just couldn't sleep. She took a deep breath and, without even opening her eyes, reached for her phone, checked the screen, then calmly turned onto her other side. Go to sleep. We have to get up early tomorrow. Her indifference should have reassured me, but instead, it only added fuel to the fire. I couldn't sleep anymore. The next day, I went through work like I was on autopilot. But inside, I was burning. I knew I had to act, but I couldn't let my emotions take over. So in the evening, when Julia said she was meeting up with friends, I did something I had never done before. I followed her. Standing in the shadows near the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her friends, I saw something that made me forget how to breathe. She didn't go into the restaurant. She got into a car waiting for her at the curb. A man I didn't recognize was behind the wheel, and they kissed. I felt the blood drain from my face. I should have walked up, done something, made a scene, dragged him out of the car. But instead, I took out my phone and snapped a picture. This was just the beginning. I stood in the darkness, gripping my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. They were kissing. Not hurriedly, not accidentally. This was a kiss between people who knew each other well, people who had a connection. I took a few more photos, then another one. Julia had no idea someone was watching her. She laughed, her hand sliding across his neck, then she got into the car. I watched as it drove away. My thoughts were chaotic. I had proof. But now what? Confrontation? A scandal? That would be too easy. Too predictable. I already knew she would lie. She would say it wasn't what it seemed. That he was just a friend. No, I wasn't going to act impulsively. I had to know everything. I went home, turned on my computer, and started searching for information. The car's number, model, color. It wasn't a rental. It belonged to a man named Anthony Grayson, an unfamiliar name. I checked social media. Bingo. He looked exactly as I expected. Confident, athletic, always photographed with beautiful women. I felt sick. I tried to keep myself together, but inside me, rage was boiling. Julia came home a few hours later. Her mood was perfect, as if she had really spent the evening with friends. She hugged me, kissed me on the cheek, as if nothing had happened. It took inhuman effort not to explode. The next day, I took a day off and continued my investigation. I started tracking her movements. I used everything: call history, bank statements, location history on her phone. Anthony Grayson wasn't the only one. There were two more men. I came across a message from someone named Jarrett. They were planning to meet. And another one, Thomas. All three were different. Anthony looked like a typical playboy, Jared was a serious businessman, and Thomas was a yoga instructor. She was playing all of them at the same time. A dark, nearly uncontrollable anger took over me. I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was gathering information for revenge. For the next week, I kept following her. I learned when and where she met each of them. I knew how she acted with each one, what words she used, what stories she made up. She was an actress, a manipulator. But she had no idea that I saw the whole picture. I didn't make a single rash move. I waited. I waited for the right moment. And it came sooner than I expected. My phone vibrated in the middle of the night. A message from an unknown number. Julia is playing you, just like she plays all of us. You have no idea how deep this goes. I froze. The room was dark, only the dim glow of the screen lighting up my face. Who was this? How did they know? I felt my heart pound faster. My mind immediately started analyzing. Either this was someone trying to confuse me even more, or one of her lovers. I started typing a response, but suddenly stopped. If this really was one of them, he might tell me more. I dialed the number. The rings felt endless. And then someone picked up. You already know about us, don't you? The voice was low, calm. Who are you? That doesn't matter. What matters is that you need to know the truth. We're all in this game. All three of us. I gripped my phone like a snake squeezing its prey. What do you mean? Meet me. We need to talk. But don't make any sudden moves. Julia is dangerous. She's not just a manipulator. She's using all of us. The call ended. I sat in the dark, feeling something shift inside me. Yesterday, I wanted revenge. Now, I wanted the truth. We met at night, in a small alley near an old cafe. I arrived first. The cold wind hit my face, but I didn't care. A few minutes later, a man appeared. Tall, dark-haired, with a tense expression. Anthony, he said, looking at me as if evaluating whether I could be trusted. I nodded. You texted me. Yes. We stood in silence for a few seconds. He looked away, as if deciding where to start. I was with Julia for 6 months, he finally said. She was always special. She liked feeling in control. She played with me, made me think I was the only one. And then I started noticing the details. Small lies. I started following her, just like you did. It hit me like lightning. Just like me? Yes, I knew you suspected something. I knew you'd start looking for the truth. So I decided to help you. I stayed silent, processing his words. She's seeing 2 more, I said. 3. I turned my head sharply. What? There's another one. I found out about him by accident. He thinks he's the only one too. My fingers clenched into a fist. And what do you suggest? At first, I just wanted to expose her, he said. But now I think she deserves more. I stared at him, unblinking. What exactly do you mean? Let's make her feel what she's been making us feel. Let's play her own game against her. I felt something dark ignite inside me. Go on. The following weeks became a game. Julia suspected nothing. She continued meeting with all of them, having no idea that we already knew the truth. I acted the same as always. Smiled. Told her I loved her. I sat in my car across from the hotel, watching her walk inside. A black dress, a light smile on her lips, phone in hand. She didn't even look around. I already knew who was waiting for her there. Anthony. She was with him on Tuesday. Yesterday, it was Thomas. Tomorrow, it would probably be Jared's turn. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb. I could storm in right now, make a scene, expose her in front of everyone. But what would that get me? My anger was fading, leaving behind cold calculation. I was no longer the man she could deceive. I was the hunter, and she was the prey. I knew their names, their habits, but I needed more. I had to make sure they all became part of this plan. The next few days, I spent preparing. I studied each of them, gathered information. All 3 lived in different worlds. Anthony was a businessman. Jared was a family man. Thomas, the one who seemed to be looking for true love. They didn't know about each other, but they would. A week later, I made my move. Thomas was first. He was the easiest, too trusting, too emotional. I messaged him from an anonymous number. Think twice before falling in love. She's not just with you. I attached a photo of her leaving the hotel with Anthony. His reply came instantly. "Who are you?" I didn't respond. It was enough to see what happened the next day. He met her outside a cafe. They were arguing. He showed her something on his phone. She kept her composure, but I saw the tension in her shoulders. A few minutes later, she touched his hand, said something, and he softened again. Thomas was the weak link. He could be manipulated. Next was Jared. He was more complicated. He had a wife, kids, but that didn't stop him. I sent his wife an anonymous message with a picture of Julia and her husband at a restaurant. No explanation, just proof. She read the message and didn't reply. But the next day, he didn't meet with Julia. And then there was Anthony. He was different. He wasn't in love. He didn't care how many men she was with, until it threatened his reputation. So I made sure he started caring. I gathered all the photos I had, him with her with the others, added screenshots of messages, sent everything to his work email with a short note. "You're one of 3. The next day, he texted her. "We need to meet." She had no idea that her little world was starting to crumble. I waited, watched. She was convinced she was in control. She had no idea that control was slipping through her fingers. By Friday, I was ready to take the final step. I created a group chat. Julia, the truth. I added all of them there. And I wrote, "Let's talk about her." I imagined her sitting somewhere in a restaurant, laughing, flirting, while her phone started buzzing with dozens of messages. Her game was over. Julia's phone rang almost immediately. She was in the apartment, scrolling through social media when she saw the notifications. First one, then another, then a third. All from different men, all with the same question. What does this mean? She stared at the screen, not understanding what was happening. Group chat. Her heart started pounding faster. She opened the chat and froze. "Did you think you could deceive all of us? How long have you been doing this? I wonder what your friends will say when they find out." Her fingers trembled. Was this a joke? But then she saw the photos. All her meetings. All her lies. She was trapped. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room, biting her lip. This couldn't be real. She was always careful. Always deleted messages, never used real names. How did this happen? Jared was calling. She didn't answer. Then Thomas. Then Anthony. Panic consumed her. She felt everything falling apart. Meanwhile, I sat in the car nearby, watching her apartment. I knew what she was feeling now. That fear, that sense of the ground crumbling beneath her feet. But this was just the beginning. Half an hour later, she appeared in the parking lot. She hurried, got into her car, and drove off. I followed her. She went to Anthony. I parked nearby and waited. She ran out of the car, rang the doorbell. He opened almost immediately, looking angry. They started arguing right at the doorstep. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I saw her lips moving. She was trying to explain, making excuses, but he just shook his head and closed the door in her face. She froze, knocked again. No response. I saw her shoulders slump. She had lost one. Her next stop was Thomas. This time, she was more cautious. She didn't knock or call. She just waited by his entrance until he came out. He saw her but didn't approach. He just shook his head and walked away. She looked confused. I kept watching. Her last hope was Jared. But when she arrived at his house, Jared's wife answered the door. She didn't say anything, just looked at Julia with disgust and closed the door. Julia stood at the doorstep, not knowing what to do. Her world was falling apart, and she had no idea who was behind it. I knew. I waited, and when she came home, I was already there. She opened the door, walked in, and froze when she saw me. I was sitting on the couch, holding her phone in my hand. "How was your day?" She didn't answer. Her lips trembled. I smiled. The game was over. Julia stood frozen in the doorway, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned white. She didn't immediately grasp what was happening. Her eyes darted from me, to the phone in my hand, to the chaos swirling in her mind. I saw her chest heave with a sharp intake of breath. She didn't know what to say. I lifted my head slowly and looked at her. "How was your day?" My voice was calm, almost friendly. Her lips pressed together. She wasn't stupid. She understood it was me, that I created that chat, that I exposed her to everyone. But she still didn't know how I did it. She took a step forward, hesitating. Edward, her voice was trembling. What are you doing here? I lifted her phone, spinning it in my hand. You didn't respond in the chat. That wasn't very polite, Julia. Her eyes darted back to my face. I could see her frantically sorting through options, trying to figure out what to do. It's not what you think, she finally breathed out. I laughed. I couldn't help it. Really? And what is it then? She moved a few steps closer. Her gaze was intense. It's some kind of misunderstanding. Someone's playing with us. Someone's trying to tear us apart. I just shook my head, looking at her with disdain. Is that your best option? That this is all just a random coincidence? She didn't answer. I slowly stood up and tossed the phone onto the table. It landed with a dull thud against the wood. You know what's the funniest part? I continued. I would have never found out if you hadn't left your phone unlocked that night. She flinched. And even after that, I tried to convince myself that it wasn't real, that maybe I misunderstood, that maybe it was just innocent flirting. I took a step toward her, and she barely noticeably stepped back. But then I started following you, Julia. I saw you getting into cars. I saw you lying to my face. I saw you playing with 3 men at the same time. She closed her eyes as if in pain. I never wanted it to turn out like this, she whispered. And how exactly did you want it to turn out? My voice sharpened. She had no answer. I took another step toward her. Now, only a few inches separated us. There's one thing I don't understand, Julia, I continued. Why did you do this? Was I not enough for you? Or did you just enjoy the game itself? Her lips trembled. It's not that simple. It's very simple, I cut her off. You cheated on me. And not just once. Her eyes filled with tears. But this time, I felt no pity. I felt nothing but emptiness. I can explain. Don't. She shuddered. You're just going to leave me? Just like that? Oh no, I smiled. That would be too easy for you. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker in them. What do you mean? I slowly walked around her, feeling her entire body tense. You made me feel like a fool, Julia. But you know what? Turns out, I was smarter than you. I pulled out my phone and opened another conversation. Let's see what happens when your parents find out about this. Her face went pale. No. Or maybe your job. I'm sure your coworkers would love to know what you've been up to in your free time. She took a step toward me, reaching out a hand. Edward, please. I looked at her with a cold stare. You destroyed everything. Now it's your turn to know what that feels like. She took a deep breath, her shoulders shaking. What do you want? I smiled. Let me show you. I turned and walked toward the door. She stood frozen in the middle of the room, paralyzed with fear. I knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of her nightmare. Julia stood in the middle of the room, her eyes wide open, her hands trembling. She tried to say something, her lips parted, but no words came out. I could see her desperately searching for a way out, her mind racing, trying to find a way to regain control. But it had already slipped through her fingers. I calmly walked over to the table, picked up my phone, and slowly typed a message. I never took my eyes off her as the words appeared on the screen. I wonder what your friends will think when I show them all of this? I pressed the send button, and her face turned even paler. You won't do it, she whispered. Oh, and why not? She took a step toward me, her eyes wet, the usual confidence that I once found so attractive now completely gone. She wasn't playing a role anymore, wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. For the first time, I saw the real her, scared, lost. Edward, please, her voice broke. We can fix this. I smiled, though I felt no joy. Fix this? Are you serious? I made a mistake. Mistake? I laughed loudly. A mistake is when you forget to turn off the coffee maker or mix up the date of a meeting. But you deleted your messages, lied to me every day, played multiple sides at once. This isn't a mistake, Julia. This is your way of life. She pressed her lips together, her hands clenched into fists. She was looking for an escape again. Fine. You want to punish me, right? You want to hurt me. Are you feeling it yet? She flinched, and then her eyes darkened, sharpened. I saw something change in her. And what will you do? Tell everyone? Let people judge me? I didn't answer, just watched. Don't you think that's just as low? What does that say about you? I nodded, acknowledging her words. Maybe, but that doesn't change the fact that you're a lying manipulator. Her nostrils flared, anger flashing in her eyes. Fine. If you're so righteous, so perfect, then you'll just walk away, right? Just leave and let me deal with this on my own. I took a step back and tilted my head, evaluating her. That's what you want? Yes. If you really care about justice, then just leave. Let me clean up this mess myself. I stared at her for several long seconds. I knew she was cunning. She was trying to turn this situation in her favor. If I simply walked away now, she'd find a way to explain herself to others, twist the story, make me the villain. She had always done that. No, Julia, I'm not leaving. She shuddered. Then what do you want? I didn't answer immediately. I stepped closer to her until I was just a step away. She tried to look confident, but I could see her chest rising and falling too quickly. I want you to remember this moment, I said quietly. I want every time you look in the mirror, you remember what you did. Every time you look at another man, I want you to think of me and this day. She looked at me as if I were a monster. You hate me. I shook my head. No, I don't even feel hate anymore. That's worse. Her eyes flickered, and I knew that was the final blow. She didn't want me to be indifferent. She wanted control, some kind of power over me. But I had taken even that from her. I didn't say anything else. I simply walked past her, went to the door, opened it, and left. She didn't stop me. She stood there in the middle of the room, alone. And maybe, for the first time in her life, she truly understood what it meant to lose. The next few days, I felt strange. No anger, no relief, no triumph. Just emptiness. I thought seeing her broken, forced to face the consequences of her actions, would bring me satisfaction. But it didn't. I left town, took a few days off, and just disappeared. I needed to figure things out, understand what to do next. But no matter how hard I tried, thoughts of her wouldn't leave me. Not because I still loved her. Whatever we had was gone. But because I couldn't believe she gave up so easily. Julia was a manipulator. She never allowed herself to lose control. But that night, she didn't even try to justify herself, didn't try to make me stay. And that worried me. When I returned to the city, I received a message. You think you've won, but you don't even know what you've gotten yourself into. The number was unknown. I could have thought it was random spam or just a bad joke, but something inside me shifted. I felt it was connected to her. I started checking social media. Julia had disappeared. She had deleted all her accounts or made them private. Her phone was unreachable. I didn't know where she was, what she was doing, and that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The next day, I got another message. She's still playing, Edward, but this time, not with you. I gripped my phone tightly, feeling my heartbeat quicken. What the hell was going on? I decided to find answers, and I had no idea how far this would take me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The messages from the unknown number wouldn't leave me alone. I could have ignored them, just moved on with my life, but I knew Julia. She wasn't the type to simply give up. She had been playing this game for too long, and she was too good at it. I decided to check one thing. From my little investigation, I already knew her habits, the places where she used to meet men. So I simply started watching. The first place I checked was a bar where we had once celebrated her birthday. I didn't have high hopes, but my intuition told me that Julia wouldn't change that easily. And I wasn't wrong. She was there, sitting at a table, smiling, twirling a glass in her hands. Across from her sat a man. Not Anthony, not Thomas, not Jared. Someone new. He leaned in closer, whispering something to her, and she laughed, lightly touching his hand. I watched as she did what she did best. She was charming him, making him feel like he was the only man in the room, the one she had been waiting for her entire life. And I realized that nothing had stopped her. I didn't feel anger, just the desire to see this game through to the end. I took a few photos, then stepped into a dark corner of the bar, pulled out my phone, and searched social media for the man sitting with her. It only took a few minutes. His name was Michael. He was married. I didn't even have to look far to find his wife. Her account was public, and she regularly posted pictures of their family. 2 kids, a big house, a perfect life. I sent her a short message. Your husband is with another woman right now. If you want to see it for yourself, come to this bar at this address. I attached the photo. I didn't know if she would come, but I was curious to see how things would unfold. I wasn't wrong. 20 minutes later, a woman stormed into the bar. Tall, confident, with fury written all over her face. She spotted Michael immediately. And Julia. As she got closer, Michael looked up and turned pale. What the hell is going on here? Julia flinched, her smile vanishing. She recognized the woman. Sarah. Oh, now you remember me? Sarah glared at Julia with a look so sharp that if looks could kill, Julia would already be on the floor. Michael stood up. Listen, this isn't what you think. Sarah scoffed. Oh, then what is it? Why was your hand on her thigh? Julia tried to say something, but Sarah didn't give her a chance. You're pathetic, she said to Julia. I've heard about you, and you haven't changed one bit. Michael glanced between the 2 women, as if searching for a way out. Sarah, let's talk at home. Home? She laughed. After what I just saw, I'm not going back to that house, Michael. And neither are you. She turned and walked out. Michael sank back into his seat, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and shook his head. Shit. Julia carefully reached for his hand. She'll come back. He yanked his hand away sharply. Don't touch me. Michael, this is your fault. You came here willingly, too. He looked at her with disgust. I thought you were special, but you just destroy everything you touch. He grabbed his jacket and left. Julia was left sitting alone. I watched her, waiting to see what she would do next. Her hands clenched into fists, then she abruptly stood up and walked out of the bar. I gave her a little head start before following. She got into her car and drove off. I followed. I knew she hadn't left so quickly for no reason. I knew she was planning something, and I was ready for the next move in this game. I had been following Julia for several minutes, and she hadn't stopped. Her movements were sharp, determined. I realized she wasn't just running. She was trying to disappear. She was set on vanishing this time, leaving no trace, no words. My focus was locked on the way she turned corners, changed routes, and glanced in her rearview mirrors. I knew she could sense my presence, but at the same time, I was curious how she would react to the fact that I simply wouldn't give up. When we left the city, she finally stopped near one of the abandoned warehouses on the outskirts. I was sure she thought I wouldn't find her here. She was careful, but she had overlooked one thing. I knew her patterns, her habits, her way of thinking. I parked my car a little further away from the warehouse so she wouldn't notice me. But from this moment on, I had all the information I needed about her next moves. She stepped out of the car, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't trying to be perfect. The look in her eyes was so heavy and distant that I could almost feel how broken her soul was. She walked across the creaking concrete of the warehouse, not even stopping when she heard the faint sound of my footsteps in the distance. I watched as she opened one of the side doors, and I knew she had set up a new hideout for herself. But I also knew I wouldn't let her disappear. She had made a fatal mistake by leaving all of this behind. As I approached the warehouse door, my heart pounded faster. I knew everything could change in an instant, and I was ready for it. I just couldn't let her walk away victorious. I slowly pushed the door open and stepped onto the creaking floor. She stood with her back to me, unaware of how close I was. "Julia," I said. She turned, and in her eyes, I saw that familiar look again, a mix of furious aggression and unease. She was trying to hide behind what was left of her mask, but this time, I wouldn't let her win. I stepped closer, and she started backing away. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly, though she tried to keep it cold. "You want to leave all of this behind, right? Go back to your old life?" The moment you decided to run, Julia, I knew you were already trying to escape the consequences. I stepped even closer, now standing right in front of her. She clenched her fists, but she didn't stop. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling again. You have no right to decide for me. I don't owe you anything. You already did, I replied calmly. And I'm here to make sure you understand that there will be consequences for everything. Anger flared in her eyes. She took a step forward, gathering all her strength, and confronted me. If you want to punish me, then do it, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. If you want to hurt me, then do it. I looked at her, but my gaze was cold and emotionless. She was trying to manipulate me again, using her usual tactics. But I wasn't playing along anymore. You think I want your tears? I stepped back. No, Julia, that's not what I'm after. You can't make me feel guilty. She snapped again, her lips twisting in a bitter grimace. You stopped believing in me a long time ago, she said sharply. You lost all faith in what we could have had. I never believed in you, I said without emotion. You were a lie from the very beginning. Julia fell silent. She stared at me, and I saw her expression shift. Her defiance cracked, and she realized she had lost control. She wasn't who she thought she was. I stepped back and turned toward the door. I didn't want to stay here any longer. I didn't want to waste any more time on this game. You still want to believe I'll come back? I asked, stopping at the door. She looked at me, her eyes empty, expressionless. She was silent, unable to find the words to answer. I turned and walked away, leaving her alone. As I stepped out of the dark building, I felt a weight in my chest. I wasn't sad, no, but something about this situation felt broken again, as if I had reached a point where there was no turning back. Julia had nothing left on her side, and I knew it. Her life, her illusions, and all her manipulations had long since lost any value to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her actions, something beyond just deception and running away, as she always did. She had a power I couldn't ignore, not just because of how she manipulated those around her, but because of how she made them a part of her game. She made them weak, and then sent them back into a world stripped of everything they once held important. I didn't like thinking about it. I didn't want to get caught up in this game again, where every move was scripted to fit a certain plan. But I knew my next action would be decisive. And no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't just walk away from it all. When I got into my car and started driving home, one question filled my mind. Why was I still doing this? All these cruel games, all these manipulations, what for? It had stopped making sense a long time ago. And I knew I wouldn't be able to take another step forward unless I understood why. I needed an explanation. I had to find that moment when it all began, when I allowed this woman to become such an important part of my reality. Meanwhile, Julia wasn't who I had imagined her to be. She wasn't running from consequences. She wasn't scared or lost. She was playing the game, but I was no longer part of it. Her expression, the way she looked at me when she realized she had lost control, said more than any words ever could. And I understood. This was only the beginning. Leaving the warehouse behind, I drove home, but deep inside, I felt empty. I didn't want to be part of this endless cycle of deception anymore. And I definitely didn't want to be part of her world. Letting her go was difficult, but I knew it was the right thing to do. And yet, I could still feel her presence inside me. As soon as I got home, my thoughts were interrupted by an incoming message. It was from Michael, the man I had seen with Julia at the bar. I still remembered his face when he tried to justify himself to his wife, Sarah. But that didn't matter. What Michael wrote did. What have you done? Why didn't you stop? This is all because of you. This is your fault. Now I've lost everything. If I ever see you, I'll make sure you understand that you have no right to interfere in my life. I read the message several times, trying to find some meaning in it. Michael still didn't understand that his failures weren't my fault. His mistakes were his own, not mine. But his words were another reminder that I couldn't just walk away from all of this. I didn't reply to the message and put my phone on silent. My thoughts were still on Julia, and I couldn't shake the feeling that even though we had gone our separate ways, we had left something in each other's hearts. A few hours later, I received another message. This time, it was from Sarah. She was just as consumed by what had happened. What kind of game are you playing? If this is what you wanted, you got it. Now I'm losing everything too, and you're just enjoying it. Did you think I'd be grateful? These messages were pieces of a puzzle that showed how everything was falling apart. No matter how much I tried to fix the situation, I was still caught in their attempts to escape their own mistakes. I didn't know why it kept happening, why I couldn't leave them alone, why I kept getting pulled back into this tangled mess of games I never created. I looked at the screen, took a few deep breaths, and realized that I would not return to these people. The game was over. But this was only the beginning of another cycle. What had happened was a lesson in how to play without guilt, without fear, without regret. I had become stronger, and that was what allowed me to build a new reality where I was no one's pawn. As I sat on the couch, the silence in the room was overwhelming. I was still thinking about Julia, but without emotion. All of these experiences were part of the journey, but I knew I wouldn't stay in it forever. This was just a phase, and I had to be ready for what lay ahead. This story had ended, but I was ready for a new game. And it had already begun. The silence in the room, filled only with the sound of my deep breathing, grew heavier. I sat on the couch, feeling time shift. The past could never return, but it clung to me like a shackle. I knew that everything I had done had consequences, and they wouldn't be easy. I hadn't yet seen the end of this story, but I could feel that its moment had come. All that remained was one last step. My thoughts often drifted back to Julia. It felt like we lived in parallel worlds, and every move she made echoed in my heart, even when I tried to shut down my emotions. I wanted to forget her, but her image haunted me. She was part of the game I couldn't stop, no matter how much I wanted to. Everything that happened was part of her plan, and I finally understood that. That evening, I received another message. This time, it was from her acquaintance, Laura. She wasn't an important part of all this, but her words made me think. Do you really think this is over? Julia isn't giving up. She'll find a way to come back. You're only beginning to understand why all of this happened. It felt like a cold wind at my back. Laura wasn't wrong. I really was only beginning to understand what was happening. But why had she chosen to reach out now? What did she know that I didn't? I didn't respond to the message. I was at the edge. For several days, I remained completely isolated. My thoughts kept circling. All these faces, Michael, Sarah, Julia, flashed through my mind again and again. And I realized I was missing one thing. A full understanding of what was really happening. I had lost so much time, but now I had to act. And I had to act in a way that would bring everything to a real conclusion, not just deepen the chaos. I went to the bar. The same bar where I had seen Julia that night, where everything had begun. I didn't know why this place felt important, but I had a feeling it had to be the ending. I wasn't thinking about Michael and his fights with Sarah, or about Julia trying to avoid me. I was thinking about how to expose her. When I walked into the bar, the lights were dim, and the air was thick with tension. And then I saw her. Julia was sitting in one of the corners. She wasn't looking at me, but I could feel her gaze. I could feel her waiting for something. She wasn't the same Julia I once knew. There was something different in her eyes. She looked tired and lost, but still, I could tell she was ready for the final move. I walked over to her and sat down across from her. She lifted her eyes but said nothing. Her gaze was cold, as always, but there was that familiar tension again. I didn't want to get answers. I wanted only one thing, to figure out who we really were to each other. You came here to talk? She asked, her voice calm but heavy. Yes. I came to end this. End this? Her face gave nothing away, but I could tell she already knew what was coming. Yes. This is no longer your game, Julia. You and I can't be part of this lie anymore. She laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. You really think it's that simple? That you can just show up, say that, and everything changes? I didn't answer. I knew she was right, but I also knew I couldn't let her manipulate me anymore, even if she still held the strings of this game. You'll never be able to walk away, Julia. You'll always come back, I said. And for a moment, I saw it. A flicker of fear in her eyes. It was brief, but I saw it. You don't know what you're talking about, she replied. But her voice had lost its certainty. I understand everything now, and I won't let you manipulate me anymore. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The tension in the air was thick. I knew this conversation was the finale. We had both reached the edge. And then I remembered something. Something she didn't know. I did what needed to be done. You don't even know how this will end for you. Julia looked up. There was an attempt to understand in her eyes. But then I felt it. I knew that her plan wouldn't work. She thought she had control. But this was my game now, and I was going to win. You did it, she asked, her voice quieter now. Yes. Now you won't be able to come back. And in that moment, I knew this was the last game. Julia had truly lost everything, and I had become her final move. But of course, she couldn't accept that. There was hatred in her eyes, and understanding. It was over. We were no longer part of the same game. Now, all that remained was to go our separate ways. How would you react if you found out that your partner was secretly playing their own game, hiding important things from you? What would be your first steps? And do you think this kind of secrecy can ever be justified in a relationship?